The records of the United States Quartermaster Department for April 1865 do not contain descriptions of sentiment. They contain numbers, requisitions, and the specific weights of coal. In the Vicksburg depot, the file designated for the steamboat Sultana begins with a logistical impossibility. According to the vessel's registration with the Treasury Department, the Sultana, a sidewheel steamer built in Cincinnati, was rated for a maximum capacity of 376 persons, including the crew. However, the embarkation logs dated April 23 to April 24, 1865, indicate a systematic suspension of these parameters. The Vicksburg Manifest shows the arrival of paroled Union prisoners from the camps at Cahaba and Andersonville. The ledger entries for these dates are cramped. The ink is hurried. Names are written in the margins. When the lines for the deck department are exhausted, the procedure for boarding was overseen by Captain George Williams and Captain Frederick Speed. The archival evidence suggests a failure in the counting mechanism. At the gangplank, the head count was conducted by sight rather than by individual signature. The records indicate that the soldiers were moved in blocks regiments from Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and West Virginia, treated as bulk cargo to be cleared from the wharf before the rising. Mississippi floodwaters reached the supply sheds. The quartermaster's ledger for April 24th shows a requisition for 2,400 rations to be loaded onto a ship designed for 376. There is no accompanying document explaining the calculation for space. The physics of the vessel remained fixed while the data entry grew. Each soldier, weakened by the conditions of the southern camps, occupied approximately 2 square feet of deck space. The technical blueprints of the Sultana show 3 decks: the main deck, housing the boilers and machinery, the cabin deck, and the hurricane deck. By 9 p.m. on April 24th, the blueprints were no longer relevant. The weight distribution shifted from the hull to the upper structures. The manifest further lists miscellaneous cargo. This included 100 hogsheads of sugar, 60 horses and mules in the hold, and an unknown quantity of coal. The ledger for the engine room notes a leak in one of the 4 tubular boilers, a Harrison boiler of a relatively new and complex design. The record shows that Captain Mason was informed of the leak while at the Vicksburg dock. The entry in the ship's log, however, does not mention a replacement of the unit. It mentions a repair. The blacksmith's receipt from the Vicksburg wharf, dated April 25, 1865, confirms the purchase of a small section of iron plate. There is no record of the plate's thickness being measured against the pressure requirements of the boiler's original specifications. The repair was executed by a local boilermaker who noted in a later deposition that the metal was scaled and thin as a knife blade near the rupture. Despite this, the ledger shows the Sultana cleared for departure at 9:00 p.m. as the lines were cast off. The official manifest recorded 1,866 paroled soldiers, 70 cabin passengers, and 85 crew members. However, the subsequent supplemental ledger of the uncounted, compiled by survivors and researchers years later, suggests that at least 200 additional men were moved onto the boat without their names being transcribed into the official record. These men were the extras soldiers who slipped onto the deck to avoid waiting for the next transport. They exist in the archives only as missing persons reports from their home counties. Never as passengers of the Sultana. The weight of the human cargo caused the deck planks to sag. The records from the onboard carpenter indicate that temporary stanchions were placed under the cabin deck to prevent a collapse onto the boilers. The ship sat low in the water, its guards nearly submerged by the river's swell. The Mississippi was at a record flood stage. The current was recorded at 9 miles per hour, flowing south. While the Sultana attempted to push north, the final entry in the Vicksburg port log for the Sultana is a signature by Captain Mason, certifying that the load was secure and within regulation. There is no mention of the 2,000 men standing shoulder to shoulder on a wooden roof designed for 100. The last recorded visual of the ship from the shore describes it as a black mass of humanity moving against the dark water, the only lights being the sparks from the twin chimneys and the glow from the furnace doors. The file remains incomplete here. The names of those in the hold, resting among the livestock and the sugar, were never taken. They were simply the count. Before the Archiventinus, this record was briefly withheld for classification. Viewers who wish to follow future releases may subscribe. The file then resumes in the year 1865. The technical integrity of the Sultana rested upon 4 fire tube boilers, interconnected in a configuration designed to maximize steam production for a vessel of its class. The records from the Cincinnati shipyard, where the boilers were manufactured, indicate they were constructed of charcoal iron, a material susceptible to blistering if subjected to uneven cooling or sediment buildup. By April 1865, the Mississippi River was carrying an exceptionally high volume of silt due to the spring thaw and heavy rains. This sediment, as noted in the engineer's maintenance log, had a tendency to settle in the lower flues, creating hot spots where the metal could become brittle. On the morning of April 24th, as the Sultana labored against the Vicksburg current, the second boiler from the starboard side suffered a localized failure. The report from the ship's first engineer, Nathan Wintringer, describes a bulge in the iron plate, a sign that the internal pressure had surpassed the structural threshold of the weakened metal. The logbook entry for 10 a.m. acknowledges the leak, but does not record an order to drop the fires. Instead, the records show the arrival of Louis Nixon, a local Vicksburg boilermaker. Nixon's subsequent deposition to the Board of Inquiry provides a clinical account of the requested expedient. He testified that the captain and the engineers refused a proper repair, which would have required cutting out the damaged section and replacing it with a fitted plate of equal thickness. Such a procedure would have taken 5 days. The military transport contract, however, paid per head, and the soldiers were already being marched onto the wharf. Nixon was instructed to perform a soft patch. The invoice for the work lists the materials: a piece of 1/4-inch iron plate, several rivets, and a layer of lead and oil used to seal the seam. The record notes that the original boiler shell was 11/32 of an inch thick. By applying a thinner patch over a distorted section of the flue, the repair created a structural disparity. Under the Boiler Inspection Act of 1852, such a repair was technically illegal for a passenger vessel. Yet the quartermaster's ledger for that afternoon contains no objection. The ship's mechanical records for April 25 and 26 show a persistent issue with the water levels. To prevent the boilers from exploding, the water level inside the drums had to be maintained at a constant height to keep the flues submerged. However, the Sultana was now carrying an estimated 500 tons of weight above its center of gravity. As the ship navigated the bends of the river, It developed a list, a rhythmic tilting from side to side. The physics of this movement, as analyzed in post-disaster metallurgical studies, created a lethal cycle. When the ship tilted to the port side, the water in the starboard boilers, including the one with Nixon's soft patch, would rush to the lower side. This exposed the upper flues to the direct heat of the furnaces without the cooling presence of water. The iron would quickly become red hot. When the ship swung back to the starboard side, the water would rush back onto the overheated metal, creating an instantaneous and massive spike in steam pressure, a phenomenon known as flashing. The engine room log for the evening of April 26th records that the pumps were working at maximum capacity to keep pace with the river's current. The Sultana stopped briefly at Helena, Arkansas, where a photographer, T.W. Banks, took a picture of the vessel. The glass plate negative, preserved in the archives, reveals a ship so heavily laden that the water is inches from the main deck. The soldiers are visible, packed onto the hurricane deck in such density that the wooden railings appear to be bowing outward. At Memphis, the ship unloaded its cargo of sugar, which had acted as a stabilizing weight in the hold. The records show no replacement ballast was added. The ship was now lighter in the hull but remained just as heavy on the top decks. The center of gravity rose. The list became more pronounced. The final procedural note for Chapter 2 is found in the testimony of a surviving deckhand. He stated that the water gauges on the boilers were foaming, a condition caused by the muddy river water, which made it impossible to determine the true water level. Despite this, the order was given to depart Memphis and head into the dark stretch of the river known as the Old Hen and Chickens Islands. The ledger for the night shift on April 26th ends with a notation of the coal consumption. It does not record the temperature of the patched boiler's casing, which was now being pushed to its absolute limit to overcome the flood's force. The record is silent regarding the exact moment the soft patch began to separate from the rivets. The archival record for the final hours of the Sultana is reconstructed from the surviving fragmentary logs and the synchronized testimonies of the watch officers at the Memphis port. At 11 p.m. on April 26, 1865, the vessel departed the Memphis wharf, heading north toward Cairo, Illinois. The Mississippi River gauge at Memphis recorded a height of 34 feet 7 feet above the flood stage. The current was not merely moving. It was carrying debris, entire uprooted trees, and islands of silt that the Sultana had to navigate in near total darkness. The ship's log, which survived in the memory of Clerk William Stratton, indicates that the vessel maintained a speed of approximately 5 knots against the current. The mechanical strain was documented by the shifting vibration of the hull. In a ship of this design, the vibrations were a byproduct of the high-pressure steam engines working at full head. Every stroke of the pistons sent a shudder through the thousands of men sleeping on the deck boards above, according to the quartermasters. Requisition filed at Memphis, the ship took on a fresh supply of coal. The quality of the coal is noted in the receipts as bituminous, a high-energy fuel that produced intense furnace heat. To maintain the necessary steam pressure to fight the 9-mile-per-hour current, the firemen, the men responsible for stoking the furnaces, were required to keep the fires at a white-hot intensity. The physical environment on the main deck was described in a post-event deposition by a surviving cabin passenger. He noted that the heat from the boiler casings was so intense that the soldiers sleeping nearest to the machinery had to be moved to prevent their blankets from scorching. This placed even more weight on the outer guards and the upper decks. The ship was now top-heavy to a degree that violated every standing maritime safety regulation in the 1860s. At 1 a.m., April 27th, the Sultana passed the lights of Mound City. The river here widened into a stretch known as the Old Hen and Chickens. The archives of the United States Coast Survey from 1865 show this area to be a labyrinth of sandbars and shifting channels. Navigating these waters required constant adjustments of the rudder, which in turn caused the ship to heel to lean first to one side, then the other. The technical data regarding thermal shock provides the clinical explanation for what was occurring inside the second boiler. Every time the Sultana leaned, the water shifted. The exposed iron flues, no longer submerged, rose to a temperature of approximately $1,200 circ, text $. When the ship leveled, the cooler water, $350 circ, text $, would rush back over the superheated iron. The metallurgical records of charcoal iron show that at these temperatures, the metal loses 50% of its tensile strength. At 1:45 a.m., the ship was 7 to 8 miles north of Memphis. The wind had picked up, blowing from the northwest. The weight of the 2,400 passengers acted as a sail, catching the wind and increasing the ship's list to the port side. The engine room log, as later recalled by the surviving second engineer, showed the steam gauges vibrating between 145 and 150 pounds per square inch, well above the safe operating limit for a patched boiler. The final entry in the perceived timeline occurs at 2 a.m. The ship was passing through a group of islands that obscured the shore. There were no witnesses from the land. The only records are the internal physics of the boiler room. The soft patch, applied 3 days prior in Vicksburg, was now the weakest point in a system under catastrophic stress. The records of the Memphis Weather Bureau note a sudden drop in barometric pressure at this hour. The river was silent, save for the rhythmic cough of the high-pressure exhaust pipes. On the hurricane deck, the men were packed so tightly that they slept standing up, leaning against one another for support. At 2:10 a.m., the vibration of the engines stopped for a fraction of a second. This was not an intentional halt by the engineers. It was the sound of the rivets in boiler No. 2 beginning to shear. The archive contains no further official entries from the Sultana's officers. The next records appear in the logs of the gunboat USS Tyler, stationed miles downstream, noting a sudden glow on the northern horizon. The logbook ends where the metal failed. Asterisk, at 2 a.m., the Sultana was a closed system of extreme pressures. The archival record of the explosion is not a narrative of sound, but a reconstruction of mechanical failure. According to the Bureau of Steamboat Inspectors, the initial rupture occurred in boiler No. 2, specifically at the seam of the soft patch applied in Vicksburg. The physics of a boiler explosion are instantaneous. When the iron shell breached, the pressurized water heated far beyond its atmospheric boiling point underwent a phase explosion. It expanded to 1,600 times its liquid volume in a fraction of a second. This released a kinetic force equivalent to several hundred pounds of gunpowder. Boiler No. 2 disintegrated, and the resulting shockwave caused the immediate sympathetic failure of boilers No. 3 and No. 4. The trajectory of the blast was vertical and rearward. The official deck plans show that the boilers were situated directly beneath the main cabin and the heavy social hall. The explosion tore through the center of the ship, creating what the survivors described in their depositions as the void. The central staircase, the only primary egress for the men crowded on the upper decks, was instantly vaporized or collapsed into the furnace fires below. The records from the subsequent salvage surveys indicate that the blast force was so concentrated that it sheared the heavy timber hog chains that held the ship's hull in alignment. Without these supports, the Sultana began to break its back. On the hurricane deck, the weight of over 1,000 men contributed to the structural failure. The deck collapsed into the opening created by the explosion, dropping hundreds of sleeping soldiers directly into the exposed, burning coal bunkers and the scalding water of the ruptured boilers. The void was not merely physical but logistical. The records of the ship's firefighting equipment, 2 small hand pumps, and a series of leather buckets were rendered moot. The blast had severed the steam lines to the main engines, meaning the ship no longer had the power to maneuver or to pump river water into the hoses. The Sultana was now a drifting, unpowered platform of fire. One specific detail preserved in the medical records of the Memphis hospitals is the prevalence of steam inhalation injuries. The explosion had filled the midsection of the boat with superheated vapor. Men who were not touched by the fire or shrapnel were found to have their lungs seared by the intake of 300-degree steam. These men appear in the records as died of unknown causes or exhaustion because the external marks of the disaster were absent. The archival evidence suggests a secondary catastrophe, the collapse of the twin smokestacks. The forwardmost chimney fell backward across the upper deck, crushing a section where members of the 102nd Ohio Infantry were concentrated. The second chimney fell into the water, but its weight helped pull the listing ship further to the port side. By 2:15 a.m., the ship had separated into 2 distinct zones, the bow and the stern, connected only by the burning remains of the main deck. The records of the estimated casualty count note that at this stage the choice for those on board was binary. They could remain on the burning timber or enter the Mississippi River. The river records for that coordinate at that hour show a water temperature of $45 circ text F dollar and the current moving at 9 miles per hour. The survivors' testimonies consistently mention a specific sound recorded in the silence after the blast, the sound of the horses and mules in the hold. The animals, trapped by the wreckage, were the first to be reached by the rising water and the spreading fire. The final detail of this chapter is found in the logs of the uncounted. In the confusion, the official boarding manifest was lost in the fire. From 2:20 a.m. onward, the names of the living and the dead were maintained only by memory, as the physical evidence of their presence on the ship was being reduced to ash and drifting toward the Tennessee shore. The record of the Sultana now transitions from a mechanical failure to a census of the current. The environmental data for the Mississippi River on April 27, 1865, provides the clinical context for the mortality rate that followed the explosion. According to the hydrological records maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers, the river was at its highest flood stage in years. The water was not a static pool. It was a pressurized, moving mass of silt, debris, and melted snow from the northern tributaries. The temperature of the water at 2:30 a.m. was recorded at approximately 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius. In medical terms, as noted in the subsequent 1866 Surgeon General's report on maritime casualties, water at this temperature induces cold shock response within seconds. This physiological reaction includes an involuntary gasp reflex and a rapid increase in heart rate and blood pressure. For the soldiers of the Sultana, many of whom were physically depleted from months of starvation in Confederate prison camps, this temperature was a terminal variable. The thermal archives of the disaster show that those who survived the initial blast were immediately subjected to rapid heat loss. In $Y, circ, textif, $water, the loss of body heat occurs 25 times faster than in air of the same temperature, within 15 to 30 minutes. The records indicate that the majority of those in the water would have lost the muscular coordination required to swim or hold on to debris. The river's current added a mechanical layer to the tragedy. The data shows the current was moving at roughly 13 feet per second. This meant that within 10 minutes of entering the water, a survivor would be nearly a mile and a half downstream from the wreck. The archives of the Memphis shoreline patrols note that bodies were recovered as far as 20 miles south of the explosion site by dawn. Specific entry in the logs of the USS Tyler, which arrived on the scene at approximately 3 a.m., describes the river surface as covered in a thick layer of floating debris and human forms. The technical challenge for the rescue vessels was the drag of the current. Lifeboats lowered from the Tyler could not row against the flood to reach those clinging to the Hen and Chickens Islands. The rescue records cite the impossibility of stationary positioning. Furthermore, the inventory of flotation found in the survivors' depositions reveals a lack of standard safety equipment. There is no record of life jackets being distributed. Instead, the archive lists the following items used to maintain buoyancy: empty salt pork barrels, the carcasses of mules that had been blown overboard, crates of miscellaneous hardware, pieces of the hurricane deck, flooring. The records from the Memphis morgues in the following days categorized many deaths not as drowning but as exhaustion from exposure. The clinical reality was that the river acted as a heat sink. The soldiers, already weakened by scurvy and dysentery diseases documented in the Andersonville release forms, had no biological reserves. To combat the cold, the ledger of the Sultana survivors contains a curious omission: the fire rafts, standard procedure for a burning vessel on the Mississippi, was to launch timber rafts to provide a platform away from the flames. However, the record shows that the speed of the fire, fueled by the draft created by the ship's own movement and the wind, consumed the rafts while they were still lashed to the guards. The final detail of the environmental record for this hour is the total darkness log. The moon had set, and the only light came from the burning remains of the Sultana, which served as a beacon for the rescuers but also illuminated the vast distance between the survivors and the flooded, inaccessible banks. The file notes that at 3:30 a.m., the burning hull of the Sultana struck a group of trees on the Arkansas side and began to sink. The names of those who remained on the bow until the very end were never transcribed into any living record. The morning of April 27, 1865, necessitated a transition from rescue operations to an evidentiary sweep of the Mississippi River. The Driftwood Ledger, a collection of reports from the Memphis police and local scavengers, provides a catalog of the items that remained after the current had dispersed the human cargo. These records do not contain testimonials of grief. They list serial numbers, fabric types, and the weight of recovered iron. The debris field stretched for 30 miles. The records of the Tennessee Shore Guard note that the first items recovered were not heavy wreckage, but the personal effects of the paroled soldiers. The inventory includes 743 Union Army overcoats. Many were found floating in clusters, discarded by men attempting to reduce their weight in the water. 126 tintype photographs, found in breast pockets or floating in wooden frames. The images were often washed clear by the silt, leaving only the copper plate and the names of the photographers in Cincinnati or Indianapolis. 62 mess kits, stamped with the designations of the 102nd Ohio and 18th Michigan. Infantry, a significant portion of the archive, is dedicated to the improvised buoyancy. Aids, the recovery logs for the area near Patty's, Hen and Chickens Islands describe several large pieces of the hurricane deck that had been converted into rafts. One entry describes a section of the cabin wall, measuring 10 feet by 12 feet, which was found wedged into a grove of flooded cottonwood trees. The wood was scorched on one side and blood-stained on the other. It was noted in the file that no living person was found attached to it, though 5 sets of handprints were visible in the soot. The metallurgical inventory conducted by the Memphis port authority focused on the remains of the machinery. Scavengers located a portion of the soft patch that had been blown nearly 400 yards from the site of the explosion. The record states that the rivets had not snapped. They had been pulled through the weakened boiler plate, leaving jagged, elongated holes that indicated the metal had reached a plastic state before failure, perhaps. The most haunting records are found in the animal mortality receipts. To recoup losses, the owners of the livestock on board filed claims for the horses and mules. The ledger shows that while 60 animals were listed on the manifest, only 4 carcasses were officially recovered and identified. The others were simply recorded as lost to the river. The unidentified body log for April 28 through May 5, 1865, is a clinical document of erasure. Because the Sultana had been carrying men whose physical appearances had already been altered by the starvation of Andersonville and Cahaba, identification by facial features was often impossible. The records instead rely on identifying marks. One man, approximately 5'9", missing 2 fingers in his left hand, wearing remnants of a blue tunic. One body charred beyond recognition, carrying a brass key stamped with the number 14. A youth, no uniform, found with a pocket Bible, inscribed to Benjamin, page 426 folded. Down, the inventory concludes with the missing manifest. Comparison, by overlaying the list of recovered items with the names of the soldiers who had officially checked in at Vicksburg. The provost marshal identified a discrepancy. There were over 300 sets of belongings or specific regiment markers that did not correlate with any name on the official boarding list. These items belonged to the uncounted, the men who had slipped onto the boat in the darkness of the Vicksburg wharf. The records show that most of the driftwood was eventually piled on the banks and burned to prevent it from becoming a navigational hazard for future steamboats. The physical evidence of the Sultana was systematically reduced to ash, leaving only the entries in the ledger to prove the items and the men who held them ever existed. The file notes a final omission. The ship's safe, containing the payroll and the official records of the voyage, was never recovered from the silt. The arrival of the first wave of survivors and remains at the Memphis wharf necessitated a transition from military procedure to municipal crisis management. The records of the Memphis city sexton and the Shelby County coroner for late April 1865 provide a clinical mapping of the disaster's aftermath. These files do not record the sounds of fjords. They record the price of pine lumber and the volume of quicklime, the morgue log, beginning at 4 a.m. On April 27th shows a city unprepared for the scale of the uncounted. The primary facility, a brick structure near the riverfront, reached capacity within 3 hours. Subsequent bodies were laid in rows on the cobblestones of the landing. The ledger for that morning contains a recurring entry. Subject, male, condition, silt-covered. Disposition, awaiting identification. The clinical records from the Washington Navy Yard Hospital and the Gaoso Hospital in Memphis categorize the survivors by the nature of their trauma. The burn ward census is particularly precise. It notes the prevalence of scalded lungs and external blistering from the waist up, a result of the steam rising through the deck boards. The records indicate that many who survived the water died within 48 hours of pulmonary congestion, a clinical term for the fluid buildup following steam inhalation. The financial archives of the city reflect the logistical strain. A receipt dated April 29, 1865, shows a requisition for 500 pine coffins, manufactured by local carpenters at a cost of $2.50 each, 40 barrels of lime, to be used in the mass burial trenches at the Elmwood Cemetery, 12 laborers, hired for trenching and transport. The burial of the unknown became a standardized procedure. The records show that when a body could not be identified by a regiment number or a personal effect, it was assigned a number in the Sultana series. The archive notes that many of these men were so emaciated from their time at Andersonville that they're pre-war. Descriptions provided by families in Ohio or Indiana no longer matched their physical remains. A man recorded as 160 pounds in his 1862 enlistment papers was often recovered weighing less than 90 pounds. The Memphis mortuary files also reveal a secondary mortality phase. The records of the local hospitals show a spike in deaths. Between May 5th and May 15th, these were the men who had initially been listed as rescued, but succumbed to river fever, likely a combination of pneumonia, and the existing dysentery they carried from the prison camps. The ledger shows that for these men, the cause of death was often retroactively changed from Sultana disaster to general debility. One specific document in the file, the Sexton's report on the 102nd Ohio, highlights the erasure of names. Of the members of that regiment known to be on the boat, approximately 40% appear in the burial records under their correct names. The remaining 60% are either missing from the ledger entirely or exist only as unknown Union soldier in the mass grave plots. The records conclude with the closing of the temporary disaster ward on June 1, 1865, the final invoice to the federal government for mortuary services rendered was heavily contested. The government auditors noted a discrepancy between the number of coffins billed and the number of names on the official Vicksburg manifest. The city's response, preserved in a frayed letter in the appendix, states simply, "The river yielded more than your papers accounted for." The file ends with the note that the original burial markers, made of wood, rotted within a decade, leaving the precise location of hundreds of Sultana victims to be determined only by the approximate boundaries of the Sultana section at the Memphis National Cemetery. The judicial aftermath of the Sultana was not a pursuit of criminalnegants, but a series of bureaucratic inquiries aimed at reconciling the discrepancy between the Army's regulations and the charred reality of the river. The primary focus of the United States military justice system was Captain Frederick Speed, the officer responsible for the transfer of paroled prisoners at Vicksburg. The transcripts of the court-martial, which convened in Vicksburg and later moved to the Department of the Mississippi, comprise over 2,000 pages of testimony. The records show a systematic failure of the chain of command. Captain Speed was charged with gross neglect of duty for failing to ensure that the number of men placed on the Sultana did not exceed its legal safety limits. However, the defense file introduces a critical variable, the presence of a second officer, Captain George Williams. The bribe allegation log, though never fully substantiated, appears in the margins of the investigation. The records include a report from an informant suggesting that Captain Mason of the Sultana had offered a kickback to the quartermaster's officers to ensure his boat was filled to capacity. The Army's contract paid $5 per soldier and $10 per officer. A full load was worth over $10,000, an enormous sum in 1865. The ledger shows that the Sultana was preferred over two other steamers, the Pauline Carroll and the Lady Gay, which departed Vicksburg half empty. The testimony of the boilermaker, Louis Nixon, was entered into the record as Exhibit B. Nixon's statement regarding the soft patch was clinical. He testified that he warned the ship's officers that the repair was a temporary measure and that the boilers were dangerous. However, the court's focus remained on the head count rather than the mechanical failure. The technical data regarding the boiler's PSI and the center of gravity was treated as secondary to the administrative failure of the manifest. Captain Speed's defense rested on a breakdown of communication. The records show he claimed that Captain Williams had taken over the boarding process and had ignored the warnings about the boat's overcrowding. The file contains a series of telegrams sent between the Vicksburg depot and the Department of the Gulf, each one shifting the responsibility for the overload to a different department. The verdict, delivered in 1866, found Captain Speed guilty on all charges. He was dismissed from the service. However, the archival trail does not end there. In a review of the proceedings dated 1867, the Judge Advocate General of the Army, Joseph Holt, overturned the conviction. Holt's report stated that Speed was not present at the final boarding, and that the responsibility lay with Captain Williams, who by that time had already been mustered out of the service and was no longer subject to military law. The omission of testimony in the Speed trial is significant. The file shows that several key witnesses, including the ship's surviving engineers, were never called to testify about the corruption or the specific orders given regarding the boiler repairs. The inquiry avoided the question of why the federal government was improperly owned, ill-maintained steamboats to transport thousands of weakened men without any federal inspectors present. The court-martial records conclude with an adjustment of the loss. The final tally of the dead was officially set at 1,238. This number, as the archives have repeatedly shown, was a bureaucratic compromise. It ignored the uncounted names that were never on the manifest to begin with. The chapter ends with the silence of the defendants. Captain Mason, the man who could have confirmed the bribe, was dead. The boilermaker was a civilian. The Army officers were protected by the very paperwork they had failed to complete. The record of the court-martial was filed away in the National Archives, where it remained largely unread for a century, serving as the official closing of a case that remained physically unresolved at the bottom of the Mississippi. The archival footprint of the Sultana in the immediate aftermath of April 1865 is characterized by a rapid and systemic contraction. In the hierarchy of the American news cycle, the disaster, despite resulting in a higher loss of life than the sinking of the Titanic, occupies a secondary or tertiary position in the national record. The clinical explanation for this erasure is found in the news cycle overlap of the spring of 1865. The records of the Associated Press and the New York Herald for April 27th to May 10th show a concentration of column inches dedicated to three primary events. 1. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. 2. The surrender of Joseph E. Johnston, the final collapse of the Confederate armies in the East. 3. The trial of the conspirators, the judicial proceedings in Washington, D.C. A comparison of the word count ledger for these dates reveals that the Sultana explosion was often relegated to the third or fourth page, summarized in a single paragraph. The national psyche, as reflected in the archival press, was saturated with mortality. In a conflict that had recorded over 600,000 deaths, the loss of an additional 1,700 men, most of whom were already returned or paroled, did not prompt the sustained public outcry typically associated with maritime catastrophe. Furthermore, the Department of the Interior's pension files provide evidence of a bureaucratic erasure. When families of the missing soldiers applied for survivor benefits, they were frequently met with insufficient proof of death notices. Because the Sultana's manifest was incomplete and the bodies were often unidentifiable or lost to the river, the government required secondary affidavits from fellow survivors to prove a soldier had even been on the boat. For the uncounted soldiers, those not on the Vicksburg list, the archive shows a 40% higher rate of pension denial. The Memphis memorial records show a similar lack of permanence. While the dead of the Battle of Shiloh or Gettysburg were honored with immediate and lasting monuments, the Sultana victims were buried in a city that, at the time, was still under military occupation and transitioning from a Confederate stronghold to a Union hub. The records of the local historical society for 1870 contain no mention of a public commemoration. The disaster was viewed as an accident of transport rather than a sacrifice of war. The technological erasure is also evident in the maritime records. Within 2 years of the disaster, the high-pressure tubular boilers used on the Sultana were largely phased out in favor of safer, more regulated designs. The Registry of Steamboats for 1868 shows that the Sultana's sister ships were renamed or scrapped. By removing the physical reminders of the boiler failures, the industry effectively moved the record from active danger to obsolete history. The final ledger entry for this chapter is found in the Congressional Record of 1869, a motion to create a federal commission to investigate the corruption in the Vicksburg quartermaster's office was tabled and never reopened. The file notes that the war is over and the records are closed. The Sultana ceased to be a tragedy of the present and became a ghost file, a record that existed in the memories of the survivors in the rural Midwest but was officially absent from the nation's monumental history. Asterisk, the physical history of the Sultana did not end in the waters of the Mississippi, but in the silt of an Arkansas's soybean field. Over the century following the disaster, the Mississippi River, governed by the hydrological laws of meander and Avulsion shifted its main channel several miles to the east. The Old Hen and Chickens Islands were absorbed into the shoreline, and the site of the sinking was buried under 20 feet of river sediment and agricultural topsoil. The excavation log of 1982 marks the final entry in the ship's material record. Using magnetometers and side-scan sonar, a team led by attorney and historian Jerry Potter located a massive anomaly beneath the surface of a farm near Marion, Arkansas. The resulting core samples did not yield treasure or well-preserved cabins. They yielded the clinical debris of a mechanical failure. The recovery report lists the following items extracted from the silt: charred oak timbers retaining the blackened alligator skin, texture of a high-temperature fire, twisted iron rivets exhibiting the same shear stress patterns documented in the 1865 depositions. A fragment of a fire tube flue, part of the very boiler system that had undergone the phase explosion. The metallurgical analysis of these remains, conducted over a century after the event, confirmed what the Vicksburg soft patch records had suggested. The iron was found to be brittle, with significant carbon buildup on the interior surfaces. The physical evidence remained consistent with the procedural failures noted in the initial inquiry. However, the archive remains hauntingly incomplete regarding the uncounted. The 1982 survey did not find a mass grave within the hull. The river's current and the explosion's force had long ago dispersed the remains of those who were trapped in the hold. The final census, conducted by the Sultana Survivors Association, before the last member passed away in 1936, identified nearly 400 families, who still had no official record of their soldier's death, only the knowledge that he had boarded a boat in Vicksburg and had not arrived at the depot in Cairo. The final archival entry for the Sultana is a certificate of non-recovery. Because the wreckage lies beneath private property and is encased in unstable river silt, a full-scale forensic excavation has never been authorized. The ship remains a closed file in the most literal sense, a subterranean tomb of iron and ash. The ledger of the Sultana concludes with a statistical comparison. The loss of life exceeded that of the Titanic, yet the memorial at the site is a modest stone marker in a rural field. The names excluded from the manifest remain excluded. They exist only in the missing columns of local 1865 newspapers and in the silent gaps of the National Archives. The record of the Sultana is not a story of aship, but a study of the unsaid. It is the documentation of how 1,700 lives can be erased by a 1/4-inch iron plate, a flood-stage river, and a bureaucracy that had seen too much death to count the individuals. The file is now complete. The archive is closed.